I walked into the executive conference room on the 12th floor, my portfolio clutched against my chest like armor. The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table where 5 board members sat in silence. Robert Caldwell stood at the head of the table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression unreadable. This was supposed to be my presentation, the moment I'd show the sustainable luxury evening wear collection I'd spent 6 months developing. Instead, he slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Your services are no longer required. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. The words didn't register at first. I looked down at the termination letter, my name typed in cold, formal print. For years of arriving before dawn, of staying late to perfect every stitch, of building relationships with fabric suppliers across 3 continents, all reduced to a single sentence. My hands trembled as I lifted my eyes to meet his. Robert's face remained stone, but there was something else there, a flicker of satisfaction he couldn't quite hide. But the collection launch is in 3 weeks. I've already confirmed the venue, the models, the press list. He adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture I'd seen him make countless times when he wanted to appear unbothered. The company is moving in a different creative direction. Your vision no longer aligns with our brand identity. This decision is final. Brandon, my husband, sat 2 seats away from his father. Our eyes met for just a second before he looked down at his phone, his jaw tight. He'd known. The realization hit me like cold water. He'd known this was coming and said nothing. I opened my mouth to argue, to defend the work that had consumed my life, but Robert raised his hand. Lauren, his assistant, appeared at the door as if summoned by invisible signal. She smiled apologetically, but her presence made it clear that this conversation was over. I gathered my portfolio, my notebook, the fabric samples I'd brought to show the board, and walked out with whatever dignity I could salvage. The clicking of my heels against the marble floor echoed through the hallway, each step feeling like a retreat from everything I'd built. Security met me at my desk. A cardboard box sat waiting, already half filled with my belongings. Photographs of fashion shows I'd coordinated, sketches pinned to my cubicle walls, the coffee mug Nina had given me last Christmas, all of it boxed up as if I'd never existed here. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the security guard's patient expression told me resistance would only make this worse. Nina found me in the stairwell 20 minutes later, tears streaming down my face as I sat on the cold concrete steps. She crouched beside me, her hand on my shoulder, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. The injustice of it burned in my chest. I'd given Caldwell and Associates the best years of my creative life, and Robert had discarded me like a failed prototype. The path that led me to that conference room began long before I ever met Brandon Caldwell. I grew up in a cramped apartment in Bridgeport, the kind of neighborhood where ambition was viewed with suspicion and dreams were luxuries we couldn't afford. My mother worked double shifts at a textile factory on the south side, coming home with her fingers stained from dye, her back aching from hours bent over industrial machines. She never complained, but I saw the exhaustion etched into her face every night. Fashion wasn't a practical choice for someone like me. It was the domain of people who summered in the Hamptons, who had trust funds and connections and parents who could finance their mistakes. But my grandmother, before she passed, had been a seamstress who made wedding dresses for neighborhood brides. She taught me to see fabric not as mere material, but as possibility. Every scrap of cloth held potential. Every stitch was a small act of creation. I put myself through the School of the Art Institute working 3 jobs. Mornings, I opened a coffee shop in River North, memorizing orders for lawyers and executives who never learned my name. Afternoons, I attended classes, often running between buildings with fabric samples spilling from my backpack. Evenings, I worked retail at a boutique on Oak Street, studying how wealthy customers moved through space, how they touched cashmere and silk, the language of luxury I needed to learn. Student loans piled up like winter snow, heavy and suffocating. I lived on ramen and day-old pastries from the coffee shop, patching my own clothes until they couldn't be patched anymore. My classmates talked about internships in Paris and New York, opportunities that required unpaid labor I couldn't afford. While they networked at gallery openings, I was steaming dresses for women who spent more on a single handbag than I made in a month. But I was good. Better than good. My senior thesis collection, a line of evening wear made from reclaimed factory textiles, won the department's top honor. A professor connected me with Caldwell and Associates, a mid-sized fashion distribution company that was expanding their design division. The interview process was grueling, 3 rounds of presentations and technical assessments, but I walked out with a job offer and a salary that felt like wealth compared to what I'd been surviving on. I started as a junior design assistant, the lowest rung on a ladder I was determined to climb. The work was tedious at first, organizing fabric libraries, preparing mood boards for senior designers, sitting in meetings where my ideas were recorded but never credited. I stayed late every night, studying the company's distribution networks, learning which manufacturers could handle complex techniques, building relationships with sales representatives who could tell me what was actually moving in stores. Slowly, I earned more responsibility. Small projects at first, accessories for a spring line, then coordinating a capsule collection for a regional department store. I learned to navigate the politics of the design floor, to present ideas in ways that made executives feel like they'd thought of them first, to compromise on details that didn't matter while protecting the elements that did. By my 3rd year, I was leading projects. The evening wear line I developed for a Chicago boutique sold out in 6 weeks, generating buzz that caught the attention of fashion buyers across the Midwest. Robert Caldwell himself called me into his office, the first time he'd spoken to me directly, and told me I had a future with the company. His approval felt like validation for every sacrifice I'd made. That was also the week I met Brandon at a company event. He was charming in an easy, effortless way that came from never having to worry about money or status. We talked about design theory and sustainable fashion, and he seemed genuinely interested in my perspective. When he asked me to dinner, I said yes, not knowing then that every personal milestone would eventually become entangled with my professional life. Our relationship moved quickly. Within 6 months, we were talking about marriage. Within a year, I was being introduced to his family at their estate in Lake Forest, a sprawling property that made me acutely aware of the distance between our backgrounds. Robert was polite but assessing, asking questions about my education and family in a way that felt like a job interview. His wife, Patricia, barely acknowledged me, making vague comments about how nice it was that Brandon was dating someone from the company. When Brandon proposed, it was romantic and overwhelming. A rooftop dinner overlooking the lake, a ring that cost more than my first car. But even in that moment, I noticed Robert watching from across the room, his expression unreadable. The engagement announcement appeared in the Tribune Society section, a detail I hadn't arranged but someone had deemed important. The wedding was at their country club, an affair orchestrated by Patricia with military precision. I was consulted on details but rarely listened to, my preferences noted and then quietly overridden. My mother looked uncomfortable in her borrowed dress, surrounded by people who belonged to a world she'd only seen in magazines. I told myself it didn't matter that I was marrying Brandon, not his family, but the separation between my life and theirs felt like a border I was constantly crossing without proper papers. After the wedding, my position at Caldwell and Associates shifted in subtle ways. Projects I'd led were suddenly reassigned without explanation. Ideas I presented in meetings were met with polite dismissal, then reappeared weeks later credited to someone else. When I complained to Brandon, he told me I was being paranoid, that I needed to be patient, that his father was just protective of the company culture. Robert began calling me into his office more frequently, always under the guise of checking on my progress. These meetings had a rehearsed quality, as if he was building a file of small complaints. You're spending too much on fabric sourcing. Your timelines are unrealistic. The designs are too avant-garde for our customer base. Each criticism was framed as constructive, delivered with a smile that never reached his eyes. I worked harder, determined to prove myself. I took on additional projects, stayed later than anyone else on the design floor, refined my presentations until they were flawless. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Nina warned me I was burning out, that I couldn't win a game where someone kept changing the rules, but I couldn't accept that. I'd fought too hard to get here to let politics push me out. The sustainable luxury evening wear collection became my obsession. I'd been developing the concept for over a year, working with innovative textile manufacturers who could transform recycled materials into fabrics that looked and felt like high-end silk and wool. The collection balanced environmental responsibility with the kind of elegance that appealed to conscious luxury consumers, a growing market segment that Caldwell and Associates had barely touched. I presented the initial concepts to Robert 9 months before that final meeting. He'd seemed interested, approving a modest budget for sample development. I interpreted his support as a sign that I'd finally broken through his skepticism. Looking back, I realized he was letting me invest time and energy into something he'd already decided to kill. The collection came together beautifully. 10 pieces that could be mixed and matched, each one constructed with techniques that minimized waste while maximizing visual impact. I secured commitments from boutique buyers in 3 cities, arranged for a launch event at a gallery space in the West Loop, coordinated with fashion journalists who were eager to cover a sustainable luxury story. 3 weeks before the launch, Robert called me into that conference room. Brandon had been distant for days, claiming he was busy with a merger analysis, avoiding eye contact when we passed in the hallways. I'd attributed it to work stress, never imagining he was preparing for what was coming. The termination letter cited vague performance issues and creative differences. No specific failures, no documentation of problems, just corporate language designed to provide legal cover. I was being erased, my work absorbed into the company's archives, my collection likely to be dismantled, and its best elements rebranded under someone else's name. Security escorted me through the lobby as former colleagues pretended not to notice. The receptionist who'd greeted me every morning for 4 years suddenly became fascinated with her computer screen. The cardboard box felt heavier with each step, not from its contents but from the weight of humiliation pressing down on my shoulders. Brandon didn't call that day, or the next. When he finally came home to our Lincoln Park apartment, it was to pack a bag. His father thought it would be better if we took some space, he said, as if the decision had been made for him, as if he had no agency in the dissolution of our marriage. He left his key on the kitchen counter and walked out, the door closing with a soft click that felt louder than any argument. I sat in the apartment we'd chosen together, surrounded by furniture we'd picked out, photographs of a life that now felt like fiction. The portfolio I'd carried out of Caldwell and Associates sat on the coffee table, a testament to work that would never see daylight. Everything I'd built, both professionally and personally, had collapsed in a single morning. Nina came over that night with wine and takeout. She didn't offer empty reassurances or tell me everything would be fine. Instead, she sat with me in silence, occasionally refilling my glass, letting me process the magnitude of what had happened. When I finally spoke, my voice was hoarse from crying. He fired me because I'm his daughter-in-law. Because he never wanted Brandon to marry someone like me. Because I was always going to be the girl from Bridgeport who didn't belong. Nina set down her glass and looked at me directly. Maybe. Or maybe he fired you because you're talented enough to threaten him. Because that collection you made is better than anything Caldwell and Associates has produced in a decade. Because he saw what you could become and decided to stop it before you realized it yourself. Her words hung in the air, reframing the narrative I'd been constructing. I'd been seeing my termination as a rejection, a confirmation of my inadequacy. But what if it was the opposite? What if Robert had recognized exactly how good I was and decided to eliminate the competition before I became dangerous? The days after my termination blurred together into a haze of uncertainty and rage. I'd wake up at dawn out of habit, my body still programmed for the early morning commute, only to remember I had nowhere to go. The apartment felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in with each passing hour. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my laptop open, scrolling through job listings that all seemed to require references I no longer had, connections that had evaporated the moment I walked out of that building. Brandon's absence left a strange hollow quality to the space. His toiletries were gone from the bathroom, his side of the closet empty except for wire hangers that clinked together whenever I opened the door. We'd been together for 3 years, married for 1, and he'd abandoned me without a real conversation. No fight, no explanation beyond his father's vague directive about needing space. I called him twice that first week, but both times it went straight to voicemail. By the 3rd week I stopped trying. My mother called every other day. Her voice tight with worry she tried to mask as casual interest. "You doing okay, honey? You need anything?" I lied and told her I was fine, that I was taking some time to reassess my career goals, spinning the termination into something that sounded like a choice. She didn't believe me, I could hear it in her long pauses, but she didn't push. She knew about pride, about the specific shame that came from having to admit defeat. Nina stopped by most evenings after work. She'd bring food, usually something from the Thai place near her apartment, and we'd eat while she told me office gossip. Robert had hired someone to replace me within a week, a designer named Christopher from New York who'd apparently worked for a notable ready-to-wear brand. He'd been given my projects, my contacts, even my desk by the window. She told me this not to hurt me, but because she knew the not knowing would be worse. What happened to the sustainable collection? I asked one night, pushing pad thai around my plate without eating it. Nina's expression darkened. Christopher presented it to the board last week. Changed a few fabrics, tweaked some silhouettes, but it's essentially your work. Robert praised him for his innovative approach to eco-conscious luxury. Direct quote. The betrayal shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. I'd expected them to shelve the collection, maybe pick it apart for individual elements, but to hand it wholesale to my replacement and let him take credit felt like a particular cruelty. I imagined Christopher standing in that same conference room, presenting designs I'd agonized over, receiving approval that should have been mine. I need to do something, I said, not sure yet what that something was. I can't just let this go. Nina leaned back against the couch, studying me with the careful assessment of someone choosing her words deliberately. What do you want? She finally asked. Do you want revenge? Or do you want to build something that makes what they did to you irrelevant? The question sat between us, heavy with implication. Revenge was tempting, visceral, the idea of exposing Robert's theft or sabotaging the collection launch. But Nina was right. Revenge was a temporary satisfaction that wouldn't change my circumstances. Building something, creating success that existed independent of Caldwell and Associates, that was permanent. I want to launch the collection myself, I said, the words forming even as I realized their impossibility. I want to show everyone what I'm capable of without his company, without his name, without any of it. Nina nodded slowly, as if she'd been waiting for me to arrive at this conclusion. Then you need a plan. And probably a lawyer. The lawyer came first. Marcus Webb had an office in a converted loft space in the West Loop, the kind of place that suggested success but not excess. Nina's cousin had used him for a contract dispute, and she vouched for his combination of strategic thinking and reasonable fees. I met with him on a Wednesday morning, bringing every piece of documentation I'd kept from my time at Caldwell and Associates. Marcus was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with an easy demeanor that concealed a sharp attention to detail. He listened to my story without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, his expression neutral. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and tapped his pen against the desk. Did you sign a non-compete agreement? He asked. I pulled out my employment contract, a document I barely read when I signed it 4 years ago. Marcus studied it for several minutes, occasionally referencing something on his computer screen. His silence made me nervous, each passing second feeling like a door closing. You're in better shape than you might think, he finally said. The non-compete is limited to direct competitors in the fashion distribution space. You can't work for another distribution company for 18 months, but it says nothing about starting your own brand. And more importantly, they terminated you without cause, which means the non-compete is arguably unenforceable anyway. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anxiety about everything else launching a brand would require. Marcus seemed to read my expression. Here's what I recommend. File the paperwork to establish your business entity now, get that protection in place. Document everything related to your collection, every sketch, every fabric swatch, every email. If Caldwell tries to claim you stole their intellectual property, we need to prove these designs existed before you left their employment. What about the collection Christopher is launching? Can I stop that? Marcus shook his head. Unless you can prove malicious intent or demonstrate significant financial harm, it's unlikely. But here's what you can do. Launch your version first, better, with clear documentation of your creative process. Make it obvious to anyone paying attention that you're the originator, not the imitator. The meeting lasted 2 hours, covering entity structures, intellectual property protection, and the basics of contract law I'd need to understand as a business owner. Marcus charged me a flat fee for the consultation and business formation, a rate I suspected was below his usual price. When I tried to negotiate paying him more later, he waved me off. I like cases where someone talented got screwed by corporate politics. Win or lose, it's more interesting than reviewing merger documents. Just promise me when you're successful, you'll remember I helped you get started. I promised, though success felt impossibly distant as I walked out into the afternoon sunlight. The paperwork to establish Atelier Turner would take a few weeks to process. In the meantime, I had to figure out how to fund a fashion launch with savings that were rapidly depleting, and no income to replace them. That night, I spread my financial documents across the kitchen table. My checking account had enough to cover 3 months of rent and basic expenses, maybe 4 if I was extremely careful. My savings, built up over years of careful budgeting, would stretch another 2 months beyond that. 6 months total before I'd be unable to pay for anything, a deadline that felt both generous and terrifyingly short. The collection itself needed funding. Fabric costs, sample production, pattern making, the venue for a launch event, models, photography, all of it required capital I didn't have. I made lists breaking down every expense, looking for places to cut costs without compromising quality. Some expenses were negotiable. I could photograph the collection myself if I bought better lighting. I could do my own alterations instead of hiring a seamstress. I could find a cheaper venue, maybe even use Nina's loft if I was desperate. But fabric couldn't be compromised. The entire premise of the collection was sustainable luxury, which meant working with manufacturers who could deliver both environmental responsibility and high-end quality. Those manufacturers weren't cheap, and they certainly didn't extend credit to unknown designers with no track record. I needed approximately $30,000 to launch properly. The number sat on the page like an accusation, impossible and necessary in equal measure. I had about $8,000 in accessible savings. The gap between those numbers felt unbridgeable. Nina suggested crowdfunding, but I dismissed it immediately. Crowdfunding required an audience, people who believed in you enough to invest in an idea. I had a LinkedIn profile with 300 connections, most of whom worked at Caldwell & Associates and had probably been told some version of why I'd been terminated. I had no social media presence, no platform, no proof of concept beyond designs that existed only in my portfolio. What about a small business loan? Nina asked, pouring us both wine as we sat in my living room. The financial documents still spread across the coffee table. I tried. 3 banks, all rejections. No collateral, no business history, recently unemployed. I'm exactly the kind of risk they're trained to avoid. There has to be someone willing to take a chance on you. I wanted to believe her, but belief required optimism I couldn't access. The fashion industry was notoriously difficult to break into, especially at the luxury level. For every success story, there were hundreds of talented designers who never made it past their first collection, who ended up back in corporate jobs or teaching or abandoning the field entirely. Without capital, without connections, without the institutional support of an established company, my odds were even worse. But giving up meant Robert won. It meant accepting his assessment of my worth, his decision about my future. It meant Christopher would launch my collection under his name while I watched from the sidelines, bitter and powerless. That thought was more unbearable than financial risk. I started reaching out to everyone I'd ever worked with, sending carefully worded emails that explained I was launching an independent sustainable luxury line and would love to discuss potential collaboration. Most messages went unanswered. A few people replied with polite encouragement, but no tangible offers of help. One former colleague sent back a single line that I'm sorry, but I can't be associated with anything that might put me at odds with Caldwell & Associates. The corporate fear was real and pervasive. Then I got a response from Tom Richardson. We'd met 2 years earlier at a fashion industry mixer, one of those networking events where people exchanged business cards and made promises to stay in touch that they never kept. Tom had been a vice president at a major department store chain before retiring early to consult and invest in small businesses. His email was brief but intriguing. I remember you. Smart designer, good instincts. Let's meet for coffee and talk about what you're building. We met at a cafe in Wicker Park on a cold morning in late October. Tom was in his early 60s, dressed casually in a way that suggested he no longer had to impress anyone. He ordered black coffee and asked me to walk him through my vision for Atelier Turner. Not just the collection but the long-term business strategy. I'd prepared for this, practicing my pitch in the bathroom mirror, refining it until I could deliver it confidently without notes. I explained the sustainable luxury angle, the growing market of conscious consumers who wanted beautiful clothing without environmental guilt. I showed him sketches, fabric samples, data on market trends, and competitor analysis. I talked about manufacturing partnerships, pricing strategy, distribution plans that started small and scaled based on demand. Tom listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, his expression giving away nothing. When I finished, he took a sip of coffee and studied me for a long moment. "Why did you leave Caldwell and Associates?" He asked, the question I'd been dreading. I didn't. I was terminated. Why? I hesitated, weighing how much truth to reveal. Because my father-in-law, who's the CEO, decided I was a liability. Officially, it was creative differences. Unofficially, I think he wanted me gone before I became too valuable. And your husband? We're separated. He chose his father's side. Tom nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. I'm going to be direct with you, Jessica. I looked into your background after you emailed. Called some people who know people. The story I heard is that you were fired for performance issues, that you were difficult to work with, that you stole company designs on your way out. My stomach dropped. Of course Robert would control the narrative, poisoning the well before I could tell anyone what really happened. I started to defend myself, but Tom raised his hand. I also heard from 2 people who worked with you directly that you're one of the most talented designers they've seen in years, that you were fired because you made Robert Caldwell nervous, and that the collection Christopher is launching next month is obviously your work. So I'm going to ask you directly, who should I believe? I met his eyes, forcing myself not to look away. I can't control what people say about me. All I can control is my work. If you believe in what I'm creating, invest. If you don't, then this conversation was still good practice for the next person I pitched to. Tom smiled for the first time. That's the right answer. Here's what I'm willing to do. I'll invest $25,000 in exchange for 15% equity in Atelier Turner. I'll also open my network to you, introduce you to manufacturers and buyers who owe me favors. But you need to understand that this is a risk, and if it doesn't work, we both lose. $25,000 would cover most of my funding gap. 15% equity was steep, but not unreasonable given how early stage and risky the venture was. I thought about negotiating, trying to lower his stake, but something in his demeanor suggested this was a take-it-or-leave-it offer. I accept, I said, extending my hand across the table. Tom shook it firmly. Good. Get me the incorporation papers and a formal business plan by end of week. We'll draw up the investment agreement and get you funded before Thanksgiving. And Jessica, prove me right on this. Make me look smart for betting on you. Tom's investment changed everything, but it also meant I had no room for failure. The money hit my business account 3 days before Thanksgiving, and I immediately started executing the plan I'd refined over countless sleepless nights. The first priority was securing fabric, the foundation upon which everything else would be built. I contacted a manufacturer in North Carolina that specialized in recycled textiles, a company I'd worked with during my research phase at Caldwell and Associates, but had never been authorized to purchase from. The owner, a woman named Catherine who'd spent 30 years in textile production, remembered me from our initial conversations. She was cautious at first, asking pointed questions about my business structure and payment terms, clearly aware that new designers often promised orders they couldn't fulfill. I sent her the incorporation documents, Tom's letter of investment, and detailed specifications for exactly what I needed. 3 days later, she called with a quote that was higher than I'd hoped but fair given the quality and ethical production standards. We negotiated for an hour, not on price but on delivery timelines and quality control measures. Catherine wasn't interested in discounting her work, and I respected that. Instead, we structured a payment plan that gave me 30 days to inspect samples before committing to full production runs. It was a gesture of trust from someone who had no particular reason to trust me, and I made a mental note that if Atelier Turner succeeded, Catherine's company would always be my first call for materials. The fabric samples arrived in early December, carefully wrapped bundles that I spread across my apartment floor like treasure. The recycled silk had a subtle texture that caught light beautifully, the wool blends were soft but structured, and the innovative cotton-polymer combination felt like luxury while being entirely sustainable. I photographed each piece, documenting the quality for my records, already envisioning how they would transform into the designs I'd been carrying in my head for months. Nina helped me find studio space, a converted warehouse in Wicker Park that had been subdivided into work areas for artists and small businesses. The rent was manageable barely, and the space itself was raw but functional. Exposed brick walls, concrete floors, large windows that let in natural light, and enough square footage to set up cutting tables, a sewing station, and a small area for client consultations. The landlord, a retired photographer named Vincent, gave me the first month at half price after I explained what I was building. Moving in felt like stepping into a different version of my life. I bought second-hand furniture from thrift stores and estate sales, sanded and refinished a large oak table that became my central workspace, hung industrial lighting that I'd found at a salvage yard. The studio slowly transformed from empty space into something that felt purposeful, a physical manifestation of the brand I was trying to create. I pinned fabric swatches to one wall, creating a color story that flowed from deep forest green through slate gray to cream. On another wall, I hung my original sketches, the designs that had been rejected or ignored at Caldwell & Associates but that I still believed in. The work itself was consuming in a way that felt both exhausting and exhilarating. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning and go straight to the studio, often forgetting to eat lunch as I focused on pattern making or draping fabric on the dress form I'd bought secondhand. Every decision felt weighted with consequence. The placement of a seam, the width of a collar, the exact shade of thread used for top stitching. These details would determine whether the collection read as truly luxurious or merely expensive looking. I worked alone mostly, which meant handling every aspect of production myself. I drafted patterns by hand, cut fabric with my grandmother's scissors that I'd sharpened until they could slice through silk like paper, sewed long seams on an industrial machine I'd purchased used from a factory liquidation sale. My hands ached by evening, fingers stiff from repetitive motion, shoulders tight from hunching over work. But there was something deeply satisfying about the physicality of it, the way abstract ideas became tangible objects through sheer focused effort. Tom stopped by the studio once a week, usually in the late afternoon when the light was beginning to fade. He never stayed long, just checked in on progress, offered advice when asked, and occasionally made introductions to people in his network. One day he brought a fashion photographer named Alexis who owed him a favor. She walked through the studio, examining the pieces I'd completed, running her fingers along seams and hems with the assessing touch of someone who understood construction. "These are good," she said finally, her tone neutral but her words carrying weight. "Really good. When you're ready to shoot the collection, call me. I'll do it at cost because I want these images in my portfolio." Another week, Tom introduced me to a boutique owner on Armitage Avenue who specialized in emerging designers. Her name was Diane, a sharp woman in her 50s who'd been in the Chicago fashion scene for decades. She spent an hour in the studio, asking about my production capabilities, pricing strategy, and turnaround times for custom orders. Before she left, she placed a provisional order for 3 pieces, contingent on seeing the finished collection. "That's how it starts," Tom told me after Diane left. "One store at a time, building credibility through quality and reliability. Don't chase the big accounts yet. Let them come to you once the smaller stores prove the concept works." His advice was grounding, a counterweight to the fantasies I sometimes entertained about overnight success and viral attention. The reality of building a brand was slow and incremental, each small victory leading to the next opportunity. I tried to remember that during the long nights when progress felt invisible, when a single dress would take 40 hours to complete and I'd question whether the perfectionism was worth the time. Brandon called in mid-December, the first time I'd heard from him since he'd left his key on the counter. His voice on the phone sounded strained, uncertain, lacking the easy confidence that had first attracted me to him. He wanted to meet for coffee to talk about us, to see if there was a path forward for our marriage. I agreed, curious more than hopeful, wondering what had prompted this sudden desire for reconciliation. We met at a neutral cafe downtown, neither of us wanting the intimacy of familiar places. He looked tired, older somehow, though it had only been a few months. We exchanged awkward pleasantries before falling into uncomfortable silence. Finally he spoke. "My father thinks I should file for divorce. Says it's cleaner that way, no complications." I stirred my coffee, watching the cream swirl into patterns. "And what do you think?" Brandon ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make countless times when he was stressed. I don't know. I miss you. I miss what we had. But everything got so complicated. You chose his side, I said, keeping my voice level. You knew he was going to fire me and you said nothing. You moved out without even trying to fight for us. That's not complicated, Brandon. That's just choosing. He flinched, and I felt a small bitter satisfaction at landing the blow. It wasn't my decision to fire you. That was all him. I was just trying to keep my job, keep things stable. By sacrificing me. The words hung between us, sharp and true. Brandon looked down at his coffee cup, unable or unwilling to meet my eyes. We sat in silence for several minutes, the background noise of the cafe filling the space where our conversation had died. I heard you're starting your own line, he said eventually. Christopher mentioned it at work. Said you're trying to launch the sustainable collection. News traveled fast, apparently. Christopher would have told Robert, which meant my former father-in-law knew exactly what I was doing. The thought should have worried me, but instead it felt validating. I was enough of a threat to be worth monitoring. I confirmed, offering no additional details. My father won't like that. He'll see it as competition. Then he shouldn't have stolen my designs and given them to Christopher. Brandon's expression shifted, surprise mixing with something that might have been shame. You know about that? Everyone knows about that, Brandon. Your father isn't as subtle as he thinks he is. He nodded slowly, processing information that he'd apparently been sheltered from or chosen not to see. We talked for a few more minutes, dancing around the real issues, both of us aware that this conversation was an ending rather than a beginning. When we finally stood to leave, Brandon reached for my hand. I'm sorry, he said, and for the first time he sounded like he meant it. I should have stood up for you. I was a coward. I pulled my hand back gently. You were. But I appreciate you saying it. We walked out of the cafe in opposite directions, and I felt the weight of our marriage lift from my shoulders. Whatever happened with Atelier Turner, I would do it unencumbered by the hope that Brandon might somehow transform into a partner who could match my ambition or courage. The collection came together slowly through December and January, each piece requiring meticulous attention and multiple iterations before it met my standards. I worked with a pattern maker named Ruth who operated out of a small studio in Pilsen, a woman in her 70s who'd been making patterns for Chicago designers since before I was born. She charged reasonable rates and had an encyclopedic knowledge of garment construction that saved me from costly mistakes. Ruth would examine my sketches, asking questions about intended drape and movement, then draft patterns that translated two-dimensional drawings into three-dimensional forms. We'd do multiple fittings on a dress form, adjusting proportions and ease, tweaking details until the garment hung exactly right. Her expertise accelerated my production timeline significantly, turning what might have taken me months into weeks. By late January, I had 7 completed pieces and 3 in final stages of construction. The collection was taking shape, a cohesive story told through silhouette and texture. There was an evening gown in recycled silk with a draped bodice that moved like water, a tailored jumpsuit in sustainable wool that managed to be both structured and fluid, a cocktail dress with strategic cutouts that revealed and concealed in equal measure. Each piece could stand alone but also worked as part of a larger narrative about conscious luxury. The photography session with Alexis happened on a brutally cold February morning. We shot in my studio, using the natural light from the large windows and some additional lighting equipment she brought. I'd hired 2 models through an agency that specialized in editorial work, negotiating day rates I could barely afford but that were necessary for the quality of images I needed. Alexis worked quickly and decisively, directing the models through poses that showcased the garments without overwhelming them. She understood instinctively how to photograph clothing, how to capture texture and movement, how to create images that conveyed both aspiration and accessibility. Between shots, she showed me previews on her camera screen, and I felt a surge of relief and pride. The collection looked legitimate, professional, worthy of attention. We wrapped the shoot in 6 hours, my feet aching from standing, my voice hoarse from giving direction. Alexis promised to have edited images ready within a week, and I knew she'd deliver because Tom vouched for her reliability. As the models changed out of the samples and Alexis packed up her equipment, I stood in the studio surrounded by the evidence of months of work and allowed myself a moment of optimism. Nina came over that night with champagne, insisting we celebrate the completion of the collection shoot. We sat on the floor of my apartment, too tired to bother with furniture, drinking from coffee mugs because I'd never bothered to buy proper glasses. You did it, Nina said, raising her mug in a toast. You actually built a collection from nothing. I haven't sold anything yet, I reminded her. Haven't even launched officially. This could all still fail. But you did the impossible part. You created something beautiful after everything fell apart. That matters regardless of what happens next. Her faith in me was both comforting and terrifying. She believed in my success with a certainty I couldn't quite share, still braced for the possibility that despite all the work and sacrifice, the market simply wouldn't care. The fashion industry was littered with talented designers who never broke through, who made gorgeous clothes that no one bought, who eventually had to abandon their dreams for more stable careers. But I also knew that fear of failure was a luxury I couldn't afford. I'd invested Tom's money, my own savings, and countless hours into this venture. Retreat wasn't an option, not when I'd come this far. The only way forward was to launch the collection and let the market decide whether I'd built something worth paying attention to. The launch strategy came together through consultation with Tom and research into how other independent designers had successfully introduced their brands. I couldn't afford a traditional fashion show with the venue rental, production costs, and PR that would require. Instead, I planned an intimate presentation event at my studio, inviting carefully selected buyers, stylists, and fashion journalists to view the collection in the space where it had been created. The invitation list was small, maybe 40 people, but each name had been chosen strategically. Local boutique owners who carried emerging designers, stylists who worked with clients seeking unique pieces, journalists from fashion blogs and Chicago publications who covered local design. I drafted personalized emails to each person, explaining the sustainable luxury concept and offering them an exclusive first look at Atelier Turner. The response rate was lower than I'd hoped but higher than I'd feared. About 20 people confirmed they'd attend, a mix of genuine interest and curiosity about the designer who'd been fired from Caldwell and Associates and decided to compete with her former employer. I tried not to think too much about their motivations, focusing instead on creating an event experience that would showcase the collection effectively. Nina helped me transform the studio for the presentation. We painted one wall a soft cream color to serve as a backdrop, arranged the clothing on industrial garment racks that read as intentionally minimal rather than cheap, and created small vignettes with the finished pieces displayed on dress forms. I printed cards with information about each garment's sustainable materials and construction techniques, wanting attendees to understand the thought and ethics embedded in every piece. Tom arranged for light catering, simple but elegant, wine in small bites that would keep people comfortable without overwhelming the focus on clothing. He also brought in a friend who worked in event production to handle lighting, ensuring the garments would be shown under conditions that highlighted their quality and craftsmanship. The night before the event, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed reviewing every detail, wondering what I'd forgotten, playing out scenarios of success and failure. What if no one showed up? What if they came but hated the collection? What if buyers were politely interested but didn't place orders? The uncertainty was suffocating, but beneath it ran a current of defiant pride. Whatever happened, I'd built something real and true to my vision. The morning of the launch arrived with unexpected sunshine breaking through Chicago's typical gray March sky. I reached the studio at 6 hours before anyone would arrive, needing time alone with the collection before sharing it with the world. The space looked different in early light, more vulnerable somehow, the carefully arranged clothing suddenly feeling like an enormous gamble rather than a confident debut. I walked through the presentation one more time, adjusting a sleeve here, repositioning a garment there, obsessive in my attention to details that probably no one else would notice. Each piece represented not just design choices but moments of doubt I'd pushed through, nights I'd worked until my vision blurred, decisions to continue when quitting would have been easier. The evening gown in recycled silk caught the morning light, its draped bodice creating shadows that shifted with the slightest air movement. I touched the fabric gently, remembering the week I'd spent getting the drape exactly right, the 17 versions I'd sewn before achieving the fluid elegance I'd envisioned. Nina arrived at 8 with coffee and breakfast sandwiches I was too nervous to eat. She'd taken the day off work, claiming a personal emergency, unwilling to miss what she kept calling my coronation. Her optimism was relentless, but I appreciated the steadiness she brought to my spiraling anxiety. We did a final walkthrough together, checking sightlines and lighting, making sure the information cards were positioned where attendees would naturally look, confirming the wine delivery was scheduled correctly. Tom showed up at 9, impeccably dressed as always, carrying a garment bag I hadn't expected. He hung it carefully on one of the racks, unzipping it to reveal a vintage Halston dress from the 1970s, perfectly preserved, the kind of piece that museums displayed behind glass. Context, he explained, seeing my confused expression. This is what sustainable luxury looked like in a different era. Same principles you're working with, quality and longevity over trends and disposability. I thought it might anchor the conversation you're trying to start. The gesture was thoughtful in a way that went beyond business investment. Tom understood what I was building not just as a product line but as a philosophical statement about how fashion could exist in the world. I thanked him, feeling the weight of his belief in me, hoping desperately that I wouldn't disappoint the faith he'd shown. The first guests arrived at 2, fashionably late for the 1 o'clock start time. Diane, the boutique owner from Armitage, came with another shop owner she'd brought as her guest. They moved through the collection methodically, examining construction details, checking labels, asking specific questions about pricing and production timelines. Their interest felt genuine, not performative, the kind of engagement that suggested they were calculating whether these pieces would work for their customer base. More people filtered in over the next half hour, the studio gradually filling with conversations and the subtle rustle of fabric as attendees examined the garments. A stylist named Jordan spent 15 minutes with the tailored jumpsuit, taking photos from multiple angles, asking about available sizes and colors. 2 fashion bloggers set up near the evening gown, shooting content while discussing sustainable fashion's commercial viability. The energy in the room felt alive, engaged, far better than the polite disinterest I'd feared. Then Robert Caldwell walked through the door. He appeared just after 3, Christopher trailing slightly behind him, both of them dressed in the expensive casual wear of people who never worried about being underdressed or overdressed. The conversations around me didn't stop, but I felt the temperature in the room shift, attention pivoting toward this unexpected arrival. Robert's presence was commanding even when he wasn't trying, decades of executive authority radiating from his posture and expression. Nina materialized at my elbow, her hand briefly touching my arm in solidarity. "You don't have to talk to him," she whispered. "Tom can handle it." But I knew that avoiding Robert would look like weakness, like I was still the junior designer he could intimidate with his disapproval. I'd invited the fashion community to witness what I'd built independently, which meant standing behind it regardless of who showed up to judge. I walked toward him, keeping my expression neutral, determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. "Robert," I said evenly, "I didn't expect to see you here." He smiled, the same controlled expression I'd seen countless times in boardrooms when he was about to deliver criticism disguised as concern. "When I heard about your little project, I had to come see what you'd put together." Professional curiosity. Christopher shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with me, clearly uncomfortable with whatever his presence here was meant to communicate. I noticed he was wearing a tie clip I recognized, one I'd given Brandon for our first anniversary, a small detail that felt like salt in an old wound. "I hope you find it interesting," I replied, refusing to engage with the diminutive way he described months of work as a little project. The collection speaks for itself. Robert moved into the studio, examining the pieces with the critical eye of someone looking for flaws. He spent a long time with the evening gown, the centerpiece of the collection, studying the construction and draping. Christopher followed him dutifully, occasionally making comments I couldn't hear but that seemed designed to please his employer. Other attendees watched this interaction with poorly concealed interest, aware of the professional history between us, even if they didn't know specific details. Tom appeared beside Robert, his presence deliberate and protective. "The craftsmanship is exceptional," he said loudly enough for nearby conversations to pause. "Jessica's attention to sustainable sourcing and construction quality is exactly what the luxury market needs right now. Forward-thinking design with environmental consciousness." Robert turned to Tom, recognition flickering across his face. "Tom Richardson. I heard you'd gotten into consulting and investing. Didn't realize you were backing amateur projects." The insult was subtle but clear, Amateur, a word calculated to undermine my credibility. Tom smiled, unbothered by the provocation. I back talent and vision, Robert. Something I think you used to understand before you became more focused on protecting territory than recognizing innovation. The tension between them crackled, two men who'd operated in the same industry circles for decades, now on opposite sides of an unspoken conflict. I felt simultaneously grateful for Tom's defense and anxious about confrontation, escalating in the middle of my launch event. Before either could continue, Diane approached, breaking the moment. Jessica, I'd like to place a formal order. 5 pieces for spring delivery. Can we discuss terms? Her timing was either incredibly fortunate or deliberately strategic, pulling attention away from Robert and toward actual business. I excused myself, following Diane to the small desk area I'd set up for consultations, acutely aware of Robert's eyes on my back as I walked away. We spent 20 minutes going over specifics, pricing, delivery schedules, and terms. Diane negotiated on some points but was fundamentally committed to the order, our conversation feeling like validation that the collection worked commercially, not just aesthetically. When I finished with Diane, Robert and Christopher were gone. Nina told me they'd left about 10 minutes earlier, Robert making pointed comments about the space being too small and the collection too niche as he walked out. Several other attendees had apparently disagreed, because by 4 o'clock I had orders from 3 boutiques, inquiries from 2 stylists about borrowing pieces for editorial shoots, and interest from a department store buyer who wanted to discuss a potential partnership for next season. The success felt surreal, fragile, as if acknowledging it might cause everything to evaporate. I moved through the remaining hours of the event in a strange fog, having conversations, answering questions, accepting congratulations while some part of my brain insisted this couldn't be real. When the last guests finally left around 6, I sank into a folding chair, exhausted and overwhelmed. You did it, Nina said, sitting beside me. You really did it. Tom joined us, loosening his tie, looking satisfied in the way of someone whose bet had paid off. Strong debut. Those orders are solid, and the buzz will generate more interest. You've got momentum now, Jessica. The question is what you do with it. The weeks following the launch were a controlled chaos of production and relationship building. The boutique orders needed to be fulfilled by specific deadlines, which meant long days in the studio cutting patterns and sewing while also managing the business aspects I'd never had to handle at Caldwell and Associates. Invoicing, shipping, logistics, customer service, quality control, every element required attention and time I barely had. I hired a production assistant, a recent fashion school graduate named Keisha who was talented and hungry to learn. She handled the more straightforward sewing tasks, while I focused on complex construction and finishing details. Having another person in the studio changed the energy, made the work feel less isolating, though it also meant managing someone else's schedule and training them to meet my quality standards. The editorial shoots that stylists had requested started appearing in late spring. A Chicago lifestyle magazine featured the evening gown in a spread about sustainable luxury. The images Alexis had shot looking even better in print than on screen. A fashion blog with significant national readership included the tailored jumpsuit in a roundup of emerging designers to watch. Each placement generated traffic to the minimal website I'd built, inquiries from potential customers, and interest from additional retailers. Orders increased steadily through summer. I established relationships with 6 boutiques across Chicago and the Midwest, each carrying a curated selection of Atelier Turner pieces. The production schedule was relentless, but I developed systems and workflows that made it manageable. Catherine's textile company became a reliable partner, delivering quality fabrics on time, even extending payment terms as my order volume grew. Ruth continued creating patterns for new designs I was developing, our collaboration becoming more intuitive as she learned my aesthetic sensibilities. The financial picture remained tight but sustainable. Revenue from sales covered production costs and minimal operating expenses, with enough margin to pay Keisha and take a small salary myself. Tom's initial investment had been crucial for launching, but the business was now generating enough cash flow to operate independently. I tracked every dollar obsessively, knowing that one production mistake or lost order could destabilize everything I'd built. In August, I received an invitation to participate in a sustainable fashion showcase during Chicago Fashion Week. The event would feature 10 designers creating environmentally conscious work, a platform that could significantly expand Atelier Turner's visibility. The catch was that I needed to produce 3 new pieces specifically for the showcase, designs that pushed the sustainable luxury concept further than the initial collection. I spent weeks developing the new pieces, working with Catherine to source even more innovative materials. We found a supplier producing fabric from recycled ocean plastics that had the weight and drape of silk crepe. Another manufacturer had developed a leather alternative from mushroom mycelium that looked and felt remarkably close to traditional hide. I designed a coat using the ocean plastic fabric, a structured jacket with the mushroom leather, and a dress that combined both materials in unexpected ways. The showcase took place in September, a cool evening with the kind of crisp air that signaled autumn's arrival. The venue was an industrial space in the West Loop, exposed brick and high ceilings, packed with fashion industry professionals, press, and the kind of people who attended events to see and be seen. I was nervous in a different way than I'd been at my studio launch, aware that this audience was broader and more critical, that failure here would be more public and consequential. My segment came midway through the evening, 3 models walking in succession wearing the new pieces. The lighting design made the fabric shimmer and shift, highlighting textures and construction details. I watched from backstage, heart pounding, trying to read the audience's reaction from their body language and expressions. The applause when my models finished felt genuine, enthusiastic, and I allowed myself to breathe for the first time in hours. Afterward, during the reception portion of the event, I was approached by a woman I didn't recognize. She introduced herself as Patricia Montgomery, senior fashion editor for a national publication, and asked if I had time to discuss Atelier Turner's design philosophy and business model. We talked for 30 minutes, her questions probing and intelligent, focused not just on aesthetics, but on the practical challenges of sustainable production and the commercial viability of ethical fashion. The article Patricia wrote ran in November, a feature spread that positioned Atelier Turner as part of a new generation of designers reimagining luxury through environmental consciousness. The piece included photos from the Fashion Week showcase, quotes from our conversation, and commentary from industry experts about the growing sustainable fashion movement. The exposure was transformative, suddenly elevating my small operation into national conversation. Orders flooded in from boutiques outside Chicago, inquiries from department stores I'd once dreamed of selling to, and requests for interviews from fashion media. I hired 2 more production assistants to keep up with demand, expanded into a second studio space adjacent to my original location, and started developing a more structured production schedule with seasonal collections rather than one-off pieces. The business was growing faster than I'd anticipated, exciting and terrifying in equal measure. Tom advised caution, warning against expanding too quickly or taking on debt to scale production. "We want sustainable growth," he reminded me during one of our weekly check-ins. "This isn't about becoming the next fast fashion brand. It's about building something that lasts, that maintains quality and ethics even as it expands." His wisdom kept me grounded when the momentum felt overwhelming, when opportunities presented themselves that might compromise the values I'd built the brand around. I turned down a department store contract that required production timelines I couldn't meet without sacrificing quality. I declined a licensing deal that would put my name on products I hadn't designed. Each decision felt like turning away from success, but also like protecting the integrity that made Atelier Turner meaningful. In December, almost exactly a year after Tom's initial investment, I held my first runway show. It was modest by industry standards, held in my expanded studio space rather than a formal venue, but it felt monumental. 20 looks walked the improvised runway, a complete collection that told a cohesive story about sustainable luxury, innovation within constraint, and beauty that didn't require environmental destruction. The audience included buyers from major retailers, editors from national publications, stylists who worked with celebrities, and the small community of supporters who believed in Atelier Turner from the beginning. Nina sat in the front row beside Tom, both of them beaming with pride. Catherine flew in from North Carolina to see her fabrics transformed into finished garments. Ruth attended with her daughter, quietly emotional about seeing her patterns come to life on the runway. The show lasted 15 minutes, models moving through the space with the confidence of people, wearing clothes that fit perfectly and felt special. I designed each piece to be both statement and staple, garments that could anchor a wardrobe while making clear ethical commitments. The finale look was an evening gown that seemed to float, constructed entirely from recycled materials but looking like something that belonged on a red carpet. When the final model completed her walk and I stepped onto the runway for a bow, the applause was genuine and sustained. I saw people standing, phones out capturing the moment, expressions of appreciation that felt like vindication. This was what Robert Caldwell had tried to prevent, what he'd fired me to stop, and it had happened anyway because he couldn't actually control my talent or determination. The after-party was intimate, held in the studio with catering and music, a celebration that felt earned rather than presumptuous. People approached me throughout the evening with congratulations and business inquiries, serious conversations about wholesale partnerships and collaboration opportunities. I found myself negotiating terms and discussing production capacity, the kind of discussions that would have intimidated me a year earlier but now felt natural and manageable. Late in the evening, after most guests had left, Tom found me standing alone near the window, looking out at the street below. "You've built something remarkable," he said quietly. "Not just a business but proof that talent and integrity can succeed even when powerful people try to stop it." I thought about how far I'd come from that conference room where Robert fired me, from the apartment where I'd cried myself to sleep wondering if I'd ever work in fashion again. The journey had been harder than I'd imagined, lonelier, more uncertain, but also more rewarding precisely because I'd done it independently, without institutional support or family money or anything except belief in my own vision. "Thank you for taking a chance on me," I told Tom. "I know it was a risk." He smiled, the expression warm and genuine. "Best investment I've made in years. Not just financially, though that's working out well, but because you reminded me why I got into this business in the first place. To support people who create beautiful things against long odds." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Tom excused himself, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd proved Robert Caldwell wrong in the most definitive way possible. I hadn't just survived his attempt to destroy my career. I'd built something better than anything I could have created under his control. The business continued growing through the following year, becoming profitable enough that I could repay Tom's investment with interest and still maintain healthy cash reserves. I opened a small boutique on Michigan Avenue, a street I'd once walked as a broke student dreaming of the day I might belong in those exclusive spaces. The store was minimal and elegant, designed to showcase the clothing without overwhelming it, staffed by people who understood both fashion and the ethical commitments behind every piece. Atelier Turner became known not just in Chicago but nationally, featured in magazines and worn by celebrities who wanted to align themselves with sustainable fashion. I hired a small team to manage production, sales, and operations, learning to delegate while maintaining creative control. The work was still demanding, but it felt purposeful in ways that corporate design never had, every decision reflecting my values rather than committee consensus or market research. I saw Brandon one more time, at a charity gala I attended as an emerging designer being honored for sustainable business practices. He approached me during the cocktail hour, looking uncomfortable but determined. We exchanged awkward pleasantries before he finally said what he'd come to say. "I was wrong. About everything. You were the talented one, the brave one, and I let my father convince me otherwise. I'm sorry for how I treated you." His apology felt sincere but also irrelevant. The version of me who'd needed his validation no longer existed, replaced by someone who'd learned to trust her own judgment and fight for her own success. I thanked him for the apology, but we both knew it didn't change anything fundamental. Our lives had diverged, and whatever brief intersection we'd shared was ancient history. Robert Caldwell never acknowledged Atelier Turner's success directly, but I heard through industry channels that Christopher had been fired and the sustainable collection Robert stole from me had underperformed dramatically. The company was struggling to stay relevant as sustainable fashion became mainstream, their late and insincere entry into the market failing to compete with designers who'd built their brands on authentic ethical commitments. There was poetic justice in watching him diminish while I expanded, though I tried not to take too much satisfaction in his failures. The real victory wasn't his downfall but my independence. I'd built a business that reflected my values, employed people fairly, created beautiful things that didn't harm the planet, and proved that success didn't require compromising integrity. On difficult days when problems felt overwhelming or decisions seemed impossible, I'd remember standing in that conference room holding my termination letter, thinking my career was over. That memory made every subsequent challenge feel manageable by comparison. 3 years after Robert fired me, Atelier Turner had grown into a multimillion-dollar business with 2 retail locations, wholesale partnerships with major department stores, and a devoted customer base that believed in both the aesthetic and ethics of what we created. I'd been featured in documentaries about sustainable fashion, invited to speak at design schools, and recognized as an innovator in an industry slowly learning to operate more responsibly. But the moment I was proudest of came quietly, without fanfare or recognition. It was a Tuesday afternoon in my studio, sun streaming through the windows, fabric samples spread across my work table. I was draping silk on a dress form, working through a design challenge, completely absorbed in the creative process. Keisha was cutting patterns at the next table, humming softly to herself. The smell of coffee mixed with fabric sizing hung in the air. Everything felt exactly right, purposeful and genuine in mine. I thought about the question that had haunted me in those early dark days after losing everything. Could I build something meaningful from nothing? Could talent and determination overcome institutional power and family betrayal? The answer, built through countless hours of work and risk and faith, was unequivocally yes. Not because it was easy or guaranteed, but because I'd refused to accept that Robert Caldwell's assessment of my worth was the final word on my potential. The business would continue growing, challenges would arise, decisions would need to be made. But standing in that studio, surrounded by evidence of what I'd created, I understood that success wasn't just about revenue or recognition. It was about the freedom to create work I believed in, to build something that reflected my values, to prove to myself that I was capable of more than anyone else had imagined possible. And that knowledge, that hard-won certainty, was worth everything it had cost to achieve. The spring collection launch for year 4 brought unexpected complications that tested everything I'd built. We'd expanded production significantly, bringing on 8 full-time seamstresses and 2 additional pattern makers to handle the volume of orders flowing in from retail partners across the country. The Michigan Avenue boutique was thriving, generating consistent revenue, and serving as a showroom where buyers could experience the brand in its intended context. But growth had introduced complexity I hadn't fully anticipated, the distance between creative vision and operational execution stretching wider with each passing month. I'd hired a business manager named Garrett in January, someone Tom recommended who had experience scaling small fashion brands. Garrett was methodical and financially conservative, qualities I appreciated even when they conflicted with my instinct to take creative risks. He pushed back on my plans for the spring collection, arguing that the experimental fabrics I wanted to use would increase production costs beyond what our pricing structure could support. We spent weeks negotiating, finding compromises that satisfied both aesthetic ambition and financial reality, a balance that felt perpetually precarious. The actual launch event was scheduled for late March at a gallery space in River North, significantly larger than previous presentations, designed to accommodate the growing press attention and buyer interest Atelier Turner now commanded. We'd invited over 200 people, a mix of retail partners, fashion media, potential investors, and the community of supporters who'd been with us from the beginning. The production timeline had been aggressive, requiring everyone on the team to work extended hours to complete the 40-look collection. 3 days before the launch, our primary fabric supplier in North Carolina called with devastating news. A fire at their manufacturing facility had destroyed significant inventory, including materials we'd already paid for and were counting on for completing the final 12 looks. Catherine was apologetic and devastated, her voice breaking as she explained what had happened. The facility had insurance, but replacement materials would take weeks to produce, time we didn't have with the launch event already scheduled and guests confirmed. I stood in the studio after that phone call, surrounded by partially completed garments, feeling panic rise in my chest like floodwater. Garrett immediately started calculating costs for canceling the event, rescheduling, managing the public relations fallout. But canceling felt like failure, like admitting I couldn't handle the pressure of operating at this scale. I'd spent years proving I could overcome obstacles through creativity and determination, and I wasn't ready to abandon that identity now. Nina, who still worked at Caldwell & Associates, but had become increasingly disillusioned with corporate fashion, took an extended lunch to meet me at the studio. She found me sitting on the floor, fabric swatches scattered around me, trying to redesign 12 looks with materials I actually had access to. She didn't offer empty reassurances, just sat down beside me and started sorting through the available fabrics, her practical assessment grounding my spiraling thoughts. What if we leaned into it, she suggested after a long silence. Made the supply chain disruption part of the story. Sustainable fashion is about adapting to constraint, working with what's available, rather than demanding unlimited resources. These 12 looks could showcase that philosophy in action, proving the brand's values aren't just marketing, but actual operational principles. Her reframing shifted something in my perspective. Instead of seeing the fire as a disaster to overcome, I could position it as an opportunity to demonstrate authentic commitment to sustainable practices. We spent the next 72 hours redesigning those 12 looks, using deadstock fabrics I'd been saving, incorporating vintage textiles from estate sales, creating garments that were even more environmentally conscious than the original designs. The work was exhausting and technically challenging, but it felt aligned with the brand's core identity in ways the original plans hadn't quite captured. The team rallied with extraordinary dedication. Keisha worked overnight shifts, her sewing machine running until dawn. Ruth came out of semi-retirement to help draft emergency patterns, her decades of experience enabling her to work at speeds that seemed impossible. Even Garrett, initially skeptical of the redesign approach, threw himself into logistics, coordinating fabric sourcing and managing the production schedule with military precision. The studio became a collective effort, everyone understanding that we were fighting not just to launch a collection, but to prove Atelier Turner could handle adversity without compromising values. The launch event arrived with the particular anxiety that comes from knowing you've done everything possible, but can't control how it will be received. The gallery space looked stunning, our team having transformed it with minimal, but elegant staging that let the clothing be the primary focus. The 40 looks were arranged on custom racks and dress forms, each piece accompanied by detailed information about its materials and construction. The 12 redesigned looks had special signage explaining the supply chain disruption and how we'd adapt it, transparency that felt risky but authentic. Guests began arriving at 7, the space filling quickly with the fashion industry crowd I'd slowly become familiar with over the past years. Diane came early, as always, bringing 2 other boutique owners she'd been mentoring. Patricia Montgomery, the editor who'd written the breakthrough feature on Atelier Turner, arrived with a photographer, immediately gravitating toward the redesigned pieces and asking detailed questions about the creative process behind the emergency adaptation. Tom positioned himself near the entrance, greeting guests and making strategic introductions, his presence both supportive and confidence-building. Then I saw her walk through the door, a woman I didn't immediately recognize but whose bearing suggested importance. She was perhaps 50, impeccably dressed in a way that read as expensive without being showy, moving through the space with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. She examined the collection methodically, spending significant time with each piece, occasionally making notes on her phone. Other guests seemed to recognize her, conversations pausing slightly as she passed, though no one approached her directly. Tom materialized at my elbow, his voice low. "That's Victoria Chan, fashion director at Bergdorf Goodman. If she's interested, it could change everything for the brand's national profile." My stomach tightened with a mixture of excitement and terror. Bergdorf Goodman represented the apex of luxury retail, the kind of account that could elevate Atelier Turner from successful independent brand to genuine fashion industry player. But it also meant scrutiny and standards that could expose any weakness in our production capabilities or design consistency. I watched Victoria examine the redesigned pieces, trying to read her expression for any indication of her assessment. After nearly an hour of circulating through the collection, Victoria approached me directly. Her handshake was firm, her eye contact unwavering, the interaction feeling like both introduction and evaluation. She asked pointed questions about production capacity, quality control processes, and scalability of the sustainable sourcing model. I answered honestly, acknowledging limitations while emphasizing the systems we built to maintain consistency. When she asked about the redesigned pieces and the story behind them, I explained the situation without embellishment, letting the actual circumstances speak for themselves. Victoria listened carefully, occasionally nodding, her expression neutral throughout my explanation. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, and I braced for polite rejection or conditional interest that would ultimately lead nowhere. Instead, she pulled out her phone and showed me her calendar. "I want to schedule a meeting at our New York office in 2 weeks. Bring samples, production timelines, and wholesale pricing for a potential exclusive partnership. We're looking for emerging sustainable brands that can deliver both aesthetic excellence and operational reliability. Based on what I'm seeing here, Atelier Turner might be exactly what we need." The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, covering logistics and expectations, but I barely processed the details, too stunned by the opportunity being presented. After Victoria left, having spent nearly 90 minutes at the event, Tom found me again, his expression conveying proud satisfaction. "That went better than we could have hoped," he said. "But you need to understand what you're stepping into. Bergdorf will expect perfection, consistent delivery, and the ability to scale production significantly. It's a huge opportunity, but also enormous pressure." I knew he was right, that accepting a partnership with a retailer of Bergdorf's caliber would fundamentally change the business, requiring systems and capacity we'd need to build quickly. But I'd spent years proving I could rise to challenges that seemed impossible, and this felt like the natural next step in that progression. We'd started in a converted warehouse with second-hand equipment and determination, grown into a profitable business with national recognition, and now stood on the threshold of entering the most prestigious retail environment in American fashion. The meeting in New York happened on a rainy April morning, the Bergdorf Goodman offices located in a building that radiated understated luxury. Victoria's team included a senior buyer, a merchandising director, and someone from their Sustainability Initiatives program, all of them asking detailed questions about every aspect of Atelier Turner's operations. I'd prepared extensively, bringing samples that demonstrated construction quality, documentation of our supply chain ethics, and detailed financial projections showing we could handle increased production volume. The conversation lasted 3 hours, covering everything from fabric sourcing to quality control to marketing strategy. They pushed back on our pricing, arguing it was too low for Bergdorf's positioning and would undervalue the brand. I defended the pricing structure, explaining it reflected actual production costs plus reasonable margin, but they insisted that luxury consumers expected higher price points and would question quality if garments seemed too affordable. We negotiated, eventually landing on pricing that felt uncomfortable, but that they assured me was necessary for the partnership to work. The formal agreement came through in May, a contract that committed Atelier Turner to providing exclusive designs for Bergdorf Goodman with guaranteed production volumes and strict delivery schedules. The financial projections were significant, revenue that would allow us to expand the team, upgrade equipment, and invest in marketing initiatives that had previously been unaffordable. But the contract also included penalty clauses for late delivery or quality issues, real consequences if we failed to meet their exacting standards. Garrett spent days analyzing the contract, identifying risks and building contingency plans for potential problems. He recommended hiring a production manager with luxury brand experience, someone who understood the operational demands of high-end retail and could implement systems to ensure we met Bergdorf's expectations. We brought on a woman named Simone who'd spent 15 years at a French fashion house, her expertise in quality control and production efficiency immediately elevating our capabilities. The expanded team required moving to a larger facility, a converted industrial building in Pilsen with enough space for multiple production areas, a proper design studio, administrative offices, and a small showroom. The move happened over a frantic 2-week period in June, everyone working to transport equipment and set up the new space while maintaining production schedules for existing orders. The new facility felt simultaneously exciting and overwhelming, physical evidence of how far we'd grown, but also a reminder of how much more complex the business had become. Training the expanded staff to meet Bergdorf's quality standards consumed most of the summer. Simone was exacting but fair, implementing quality control checkpoints throughout the production process, documenting every deviation from specifications, creating systems that caught problems early rather than discovering them at final inspection. Some of the original team members struggled with the increased rigor, accustomed to the more informal approach we'd used when the business was smaller. I had to have difficult conversations about expectations and performance, sometimes making personnel changes that felt like betraying people who'd believed in Atelier Turner from the beginning. The first collection for Bergdorf Goodman was due in September, a 15-piece capsule that needed to be perfect in every detail. I designed pieces that balanced my aesthetic vision with their merchandising requirements, garments that felt authentically Atelier Turner, while also meeting the commercial expectations of luxury retail. The pressure was immense, every decision feeling weighted with consequence, knowing that failure would damage not just this partnership, but the brand's broader reputation. Production proceeded with meticulous attention to detail, Simone rejecting pieces that didn't meet standards even when the flaws were barely visible. We ended up producing 20% more garments than required to ensure we had perfect examples to deliver, the additional cost eating into margins but necessary for maintaining quality. The final collection was beautiful, garments that I was genuinely proud of, but the process of creating them had been grueling in ways that made me question whether this level of growth was actually what I wanted. Nina visited the new facility one evening after most of the staff had left, finding me alone in the design studio, sketching ideas for the next collection. She walked through the space slowly, taking in the professional equipment, the organized production areas, the evidence of legitimate business success. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a complicated mixture of pride and concern. "This is amazing, Jessica. You've built something huge, something that proves you're one of the best designers of your generation. But are you happy?" The question caught me off guard, forced me to confront feelings I'd been suppressing beneath the constant pressure of deadlines and decisions. Was I happy? I was successful, respected, financially secure, everything I'd fought for after Robert fired me. But the work itself had changed, become less about pure creative expression, and more about managing systems and meeting commercial expectations. I spent more time in meetings than at the design table, more energy on business strategy than on the intuitive creative process that had drawn me to fashion in the first place. I don't know, I admitted. Sometimes I miss when it was just me in that warehouse studio making clothes because I loved making clothes, not because a contract required specific delivery dates and production volumes. Nina sat down across from me, her expression understanding. "You know you don't have to keep growing, right? You could stay at this size, maybe even scale back, focus on the creative work that actually matters to you. Success doesn't have to mean constantly expanding." Her words articulated something I'd been feeling but hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. The pressure to grow had come partially from market expectations and business opportunities, but also from an internal need to prove myself beyond any doubt, to build something so successful that no one could ever question my talent or dismiss my work. But somewhere in that drive for validation, I'd lost touch with the original impulse that made me want to design clothes in the first place. The Bergdorf collection launched in October, featured prominently in their sustainability showcase and marketed as representing the future of conscious luxury. The pieces sold well, generating positive press and leading to immediate requests for expanded partnership terms. Victoria called personally to congratulate me, discussing plans for a larger collection the following season and potential collaboration on exclusive designs. Everything pointed toward continued expansion and opportunity, the trajectory of undeniable business success. But I found myself hesitating, feeling resistant to commitments that would push the brand even further from its origins. I scheduled a meeting with Tom, needing his perspective on decisions that felt more existential than strategic. We met at his office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across his desk, as I tried to articulate the conflict I was experiencing between business growth and creative satisfaction. Tom listened carefully, as he always did, letting me work through the complexity without rushing to solutions. When I finally fell silent, he leaned back in his chair and smiled with an expression that suggested he'd been waiting for this conversation. "I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you," he said. "The best investment isn't always the one that generates the highest financial return. Sometimes it's the one that allows talented people to do their best work in ways that fulfill them. If staying smaller means you create better designs and feel more connected to the work, that's probably the right choice, even if it means leaving money on the table." His permission to prioritize creative satisfaction over growth felt like relief, validation that success could be defined by internal standards rather than external metrics. We spent the next hour discussing what a sustainable business model might look like, one that generated sufficient revenue without requiring the constant expansion that was pulling me away from actual design work. Tom suggested maintaining the Bergdorf partnership but limiting its scope, continuing with our existing boutique relationships, and being selective about new opportunities based on whether they aligned with the brand's core values and my creative interests. I implemented those changes gradually over the following year, having honest conversations with retail partners about capacity limitations, turning down opportunities that would require compromising quality or creative control, and restructuring the business to prioritize sustainability over growth. Some people in the fashion industry viewed these decisions as short-sighted, evidence that I lacked the ambition or business acumen to capitalize on momentum. But I was learning that other people's definitions of success didn't have to determine my choices, that the courage to say no was as important as the courage to say yes. The business stabilized at a size that felt manageable, generating healthy revenue without consuming every hour of my life. I scaled back the team to include only people who were genuinely committed to the brand's values and quality standards, creating a culture that prioritized craft over speed. I spent more time designing and less time in meetings, reconnecting with the creative process that had made me fall in love with fashion in the first place. The work became satisfying again, purposeful in ways that pure business growth had never been. Robert Caldwell's company filed for bankruptcy in the spring of my 5th year running Atelier Turner. The news broke in Women's Wear Daily, a detailed article about mismanagement and failure to adapt to changing market conditions. Caldwell and Associates had tried to pivot toward sustainable fashion too late, their insincere efforts transparently opportunistic to consumers who valued authentic commitment. The company had also faced legal challenges related to labor practices and environmental violations, issues that had been covered up during Robert's tenure, but eventually emerged through investigative reporting. I felt no satisfaction in his failure, just a kind of quiet acknowledgement that his approach to business, prioritizing control and short-term profit over innovation and ethics, had inevitable consequences. Christopher, who'd been promoted to creative director after my termination, was mentioned in the article as one of several executives being investigated for their role in fraudulent sustainability claims. The collection he'd launched under his name, My Stolen Designs, had been cited as evidence of the company's broader pattern of deception. Brandon reached out one final time, asking to meet for coffee. He looked diminished somehow, the easy confidence of our early relationship replaced by visible uncertainty. He told me he'd left Caldwell and Associates months before the bankruptcy, unable to reconcile his father's business practices with his own growing ethical concerns. He was working for a small consulting firm now, helping fashion brands implement genuine sustainability initiatives, trying to make amends for years of complicity in his father's corruption. "I'm proud of what you've built," he said, the words sounding genuine. "You were always more talented and braver than I gave you credit for. I spent too long letting my father's perspective define reality, and I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you when it mattered." His apology felt sincere and also irrelevant to my current life. We'd both moved beyond the people we'd been during our marriage, grown in directions that would never realign. I thanked him for the apology and wished him well with his new work, but we both understood this conversation was a closing rather than a reconnection. Whatever debt existed between us, emotional or otherwise, was now settled. The 6th anniversary of Atelier Turner passed quietly, marked not by dramatic celebration, but by steady satisfaction in work that felt meaningful and sustainable. The brand had achieved a kind of equilibrium, successful enough to be financially stable, respected enough to attract talented collaborators, but sized appropriately for the level of creative control and personal involvement I needed to feel fulfilled. We produced 2 collections annually, maintained relationships with carefully selected retail partners, and occasionally took on custom commission work for clients who valued the brand's aesthetic and ethics. I'd achieved something I hadn't initially recognized as the goal, not just success in opposition to Robert Caldwell's dismissal, but the creation of a life and career structured around my actual values and interests. The vindication wasn't in becoming bigger or more profitable than Caldwell and Associates, though that had happened accidentally. It was in building something authentic that sustained itself through genuine quality and ethical practices, rather than exploitation and deception. Nina eventually left her corporate job and joined Atelier Turner full-time, bringing her operational expertise and institutional knowledge of the fashion industry. Her presence allowed me to focus even more on design, while trusting that business aspects were being handled competently. We worked well together, our different strengths complementing each other, creating a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. The studio felt collaborative rather than hierarchical, everyone contributing their expertise toward collective success rather than individual advancement. On a cool October morning in year 7, I stood in the design studio, working on sketches for the spring collection. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating fabric samples spread across my work table. The studio hummed with quiet, productive energy, seamstresses working on production pieces, Nina reviewing wholesale orders, Keisha consulting with a client about a custom commission. Everything felt balanced and purposeful, exactly what I'd hoped to create when I first started this journey. My grandmother's sewing scissors sat on the table beside my sketches, the same scissors she'd used to make wedding dresses in our Bridgeport neighborhood decades earlier. I'd inherited them after her death, carried them through design school and my years at Caldwell & Associates, packed them in that cardboard box when security escorted me out. They'd cut every piece of fabric in every Atelier Turner collection, a physical connection between her immigrant dreams and my realized ambitions. I thought about the question I'd asked myself in those dark days after being fired, whether I could build something meaningful from nothing, whether talent and determination were enough to overcome institutional power and family betrayal. The answer had been yes, but not in the straightforward way I'd initially imagined. Success hadn't come from simply proving Robert Caldwell wrong or achieving some objective measure of fashion industry validation. It had come from staying true to my values even when that meant limiting growth, from defining success by internal satisfaction rather than external metrics, from building something sustainable in both environmental and personal terms. The fashion industry would continue evolving, new challenges and opportunities would emerge, and Atelier Turner would need to adapt to remain relevant. But the foundation was solid now, built on authentic commitment to quality and ethics, rather than empty marketing claims or exploitative practices. Whatever happened next, I knew the brand could weather it, because it was rooted in principles that didn't shift with market trends or competitive pressures. Nina looked up from her desk and caught me staring out the window, lost in reflection. She smiled with the easy familiarity of someone who knew me well enough to read my moods. Good thoughts or just spacing out? Good thoughts, I confirmed, just appreciating how far we've come. She nodded, understanding without needing elaboration. We've built something worth protecting. Something real. And that reality, earned through years of work and risk and unwavering commitment to vision, was worth more than any revenge against Robert Caldwell or any external validation of success. I'd set out to prove I could design and sell beautiful clothes after being fired for threatening my father-in-law's ego. I'd ended up creating a life structured around work I genuinely loved, surrounded by people who shared my values, contributing to an industry slowly learning to operate more ethically. The journey from termination to fulfillment hadn't been linear or easy, but it had been mine, shaped by my choices and my refusal to accept other people's limitations on my potential. That knowledge, that hard-won understanding of my own capability and worth, was the real luxury I'd created. Not the clothes themselves, beautiful as they were, but the freedom to create them on my own terms, accountable to my own standards, building success that reflected who I actually was rather than who anyone else thought I should be. The invitation arrived on a gray November morning, elegant cream cardstock with embossed lettering requesting my presence at the Chicago Fashion Institute's annual gala. They were honoring sustainable designers who transformed the industry through innovation and ethical practice. My name appeared on the list of recipients, alongside established brands I'd admired for years, designers whose work had influenced my own approach to conscious luxury. Nina found me staring at the invitation, a complicated expression on my face. "You're going, obviously," she said, not making it a question. "I don't know. These industry events always feel performative, like we're congratulating ourselves for doing what should be basic standard practice." She took the invitation from my hands, reading it carefully. "This isn't about performance, Jessica. It's about documentation. 10 years from now, people will look back at who was recognized during this transition period in fashion history. Your name should be in that record." Her perspective shifted something in my thinking. I'd spent years focused on the work itself, uncomfortable with attention or accolades, but she was right that visibility mattered beyond personal recognition. Young designers needed to see that sustainable practices could lead to legitimate success, that ethical commitments weren't career limitations but potential advantages. The gala took place at the Art Institute. The grand hall transformed with dramatic lighting and minimal elegant decor. I wore one of my own designs, naturally, a floor-length gown in recycled silk that caught light beautifully, while making a clear statement about what luxury could mean in contemporary fashion. Walking into that space, surrounded by industry leaders and cultural influencers, I felt simultaneously confident and slightly surreal, still occasionally surprised by how far I'd traveled from that termination meeting 7 years earlier. Tom attended as my guest, looking distinguished in formal wear, his presence grounding as always. We moved through the pre-dinner reception, making small talk with other honorees and industry professionals. Several people approached to congratulate me on Atelier Turner's success, mentioning specific pieces they'd seen or purchased, sharing how the brand had influenced their own thinking about sustainable fashion. Each conversation felt validating, evidence that the work mattered beyond my own personal redemption arc. Then I saw Robert Caldwell across the room. He looked older, diminished in ways that went beyond physical aging. The bankruptcy had clearly taken its toll, the confident authority he'd once projected replaced by something more tentative and uncertain. He was talking to someone I didn't recognize, but his eyes found mine across the crowded space, and for a moment we simply looked at each other, years of complicated history compressed into silent acknowledgement. He crossed the room toward me, and I felt my body tense instinctively, old defensive patterns activating despite knowing he no longer had any power over my life or career. Tom's hand briefly touched my elbow in quiet support, but he didn't intervene, understanding this was a moment I needed to navigate independently. "Jessica," Robert said, his voice lacking its former commanding tone. "Congratulations on your recognition tonight. It's well-deserved." The apology I might have expected didn't come, just that simple acknowledgement, and I realized I no longer needed it. His validation or remorse were irrelevant to the life I'd built, the success I'd achieved entirely independent of his opinion or influence. "Thank you," I replied evenly, offering nothing more. We stood in awkward silence for a moment before he spoke again. "I was wrong about you. About your talent, your potential. I let personal feelings interfere with professional judgment, and I've spent years regretting that decision." His admission should have felt like victory, the vindication I'd once desperately craved. Instead, it just felt sad, a powerful man confronting the consequences of choices made from insecurity rather than wisdom. I'd spent years building something meaningful while he'd spent years losing everything he tried to protect through control and deception. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him, and I meant it. Not because his apology changed anything, but because closure had value even when it came too late to matter emotionally. He nodded, seeming to understand that nothing more needed to be said, and moved away into the crowd. Tom watched him go, then looked at me with quiet assessment. "How do you feel?" I considered the question honestly. Mostly nothing. A little sorry for him, maybe, but nothing that touches who I am now. "That's how you know you've actually moved past it," Tom said. "When their story stops being your story." The ceremony itself was elegant and mercifully brief, each honoree receiving their recognition with short speeches about their contributions to sustainable fashion. When my name was called, I walked to the stage, accepting the award while cameras flashed and the audience applauded. I'd prepared brief remarks, thanking the people who'd supported Atelier Turner's journey, acknowledging the collaborative nature of creating ethical fashion, emphasizing that industry transformation required collective commitment rather than individual heroism. But standing at that podium, looking out at the gathered fashion community, I found myself deviating from my prepared speech, speaking from something more immediate and true. 7 years ago, I was fired from a job I loved for reasons that had nothing to do with my work quality or creative vision. That termination felt like the end of my career, the end of my dreams about what I might contribute to fashion. Instead, it became the beginning of understanding that real creative freedom requires independence, that the most meaningful work often happens outside institutional structures that prioritize control over innovation. I paused, gathering my thoughts, aware of Robert somewhere in the audience hearing these words. Building Atelier Turner taught me that success isn't about proving people wrong or achieving revenge against those who dismissed you. It's about creating work that reflects your actual values, building systems that allow talented people to thrive, contributing to industry change through authentic commitment rather than performative gestures. The recognition I'm receiving tonight isn't mine alone. It belongs to every person who believes sustainable luxury was possible when that seemed idealistic and uncommercial, every seamstress who took pride in quality construction, every customer who chose to support ethical fashion, even when easier options existed. The applause that followed felt different from earlier recognition, more personal somehow, as if I'd articulated something others in the room had also experienced but hadn't found words for. I returned to my seat beside Tom, feeling lighter, as if speaking those truths publicly had released something I hadn't realized I was still carrying. The evening concluded with dinner and dancing, the formal program giving way to more relaxed celebration. I spent time talking with other honorees, learning about their work, discussing challenges and strategies for continuing to push fashion toward more sustainable practices. These conversations felt energizing, reminding me that I was part of a larger movement, that individual brand success mattered less than collective industry transformation. Nina texted late in the evening, having watched the ceremony livestream from home. That speech was perfect. Honest without being bitter, proud without being arrogant. You've really grown into this role. Her message made me smile, appreciation for how she'd witnessed and supported every stage of this journey, from the devastating termination through the uncertain early days of building Atelier Turner, to tonight's formal recognition. Success felt sweeter shared with people who'd believed in me before there was any evidence their faith was justified. Driving home through quiet city streets, I thought about the question the gala had implicitly asked: what constituted meaningful contribution to fashion's evolution? The answer wasn't just about creating beautiful clothes or building profitable businesses, though those things mattered. It was about proving that different approaches were possible, that success didn't require exploitation or deception, that creative vision and ethical practice could coexist and even strengthen each other. Robert Caldwell had tried to end my career because he saw me as a threat to his control and authority. Instead, he'd accidentally freed me to build something more authentic and sustainable than anything I could have created within his company's constraints. That irony wasn't lost on me, the way his attempt at destruction had actually enabled my most meaningful work. The real victory wasn't the awards or recognition or even the business success. It was the quiet satisfaction of work done well according to my own standards, the knowledge that I'd built something genuine in an industry often dominated by superficiality and exploitation, the understanding that I'd helped, even in some small way, shift fashion toward practices that respected both people and planet. That night, standing in my apartment, I hung the award on the wall beside my grandmother's photograph, a visual connection between her immigrant dreams and my realized ambitions. She would have been proud, I thought, not just of the recognition but of the values that had earned it, the commitment to quality and ethics that she'd embodied in her own work making wedding dresses for neighborhood brides. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, design decisions and business problems, and the ongoing work of maintaining a brand in a competitive industry. But tonight, I allowed myself to simply appreciate how far I'd traveled, the obstacles overcome, the life built through determination and refusal to accept other people's limitations on my potential. And that appreciation, that hard-won peace with my own journey, was worth more than any revenge or validation or external measure of success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up.